Has evidence been produced that effectively clears the leading suspect to be the man known to history as Jack the Ripper, Charles Lechmere? Has that evidence been found? It's not exactly a secret that this YouTube channel revolves around making the case that Charles Lechmere is by far the most likely culprit for these horrendous crimes, and others, including the Thames Torso murders and various unsolved killings in London during the late Victorian period in the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s. After all, this channel is called the House of Lechmere, which is a bit of a giveaway. But has Lechmere been shown to be innocent? Has he been wrongly accused by people like me? Polly Nichols was murdered in Bucks Row in Whitechapel in the early hours of the morning of Friday the 31st of August 1888. She was the first of the so-called canonical Jack the Ripper murders, in connection with which Charles Lechmere appeared as a witness at the inquest under his alias Charles Cross. Now, some people claim that Lechmere must be innocent because a witness heard Polly Nichols being murdered 10 or so minutes before Lechmere was even on the crime scene at Bucks Row. In other words, this witness heard Polly Nichols being murdered by somebody else. The witness was called Harriet Lilley, and I will tell her story, which is entirely based on the following account, which first appeared in the Echo newspaper on the evening of Thursday the 6th of September. I will read it verbatim and I'll put it on the screen word for word. An important statement throwing considerable light on a point hitherto surrounded with some uncertainty. The time the crime was committed in Bucks Row, or the body deposited there, was made this afternoon by Mrs. Harriet Lily, who lives 2 doors from the spot where the deceased was discovered. Mrs. Lily said,
"I slept in front of the house and I could hear everything that occurred in the street. On that Thursday night I was somehow very restless. Well, I heard something I mentioned to my husband in the morning. It was a painful moan, 2 or 3 faint gasps, and then it passed away. It was quite dark at the time, but a luggage went by as I heard the sounds. There was too a sound of whispers underneath the window. I distinctly heard voices, but cannot say what was said. It was too faint. I then woke my husband and said to him, 'I don't know what possesses me, but I cannot sleep tonight.'"
Mrs. Lily added that as soon as she heard of the murders, she came to the conclusion that the voices she heard were in some way connected with it. The cries were very different from those of an ordinary street brawl. It has been ascertained that on the morning of the date of the murder, a goods train passed on the East London Railway at about 3:30, the 3:07 out of New Cross, which was probably the time when Mary Ann Nichols was either killed or placed in Bucks Row. Being able to forensically dissect the value of a witness is very important in understanding any case, not just within the Jack the Ripper, and not just Harriet Lily within Jack the Ripper. So I'll go through the Harriet Lily statement as an exercise in dissecting the value and finding out the value of a statement. Harriet Lily gave this interview on the afternoon of Thursday the 6th of September, almost exactly a week after the events occurred. The 1891 census confirms that Harriet Lily lived at 7 Bucks Row, which was indeed just 2 doors down from the crime scene, where Polly Nichols' body had been, murdered body was found outside Brown Stable Yard. Another family shared the house, and the Lillys lived on the upper or first floor, or in America they call it the second floor. This contemporary map shows just how close number 7 was to the railway line that connected to New Cross. Loads of newspapers reproduced this story right up to their Sunday editions on the 9th of September. To summarise the story, Harriet Lily claimed that she heard a painful moan, 2 or 3 faint gasps as a late night goods train, you can hear a train going past now on virtually the same line, not quite the same line, virtually the same line, as a late night goods train passed. Then at some other time she heard voices whispering under her window. This is presumed to be the murder of Polly Nichols when the train passed, followed a short while later by Robert Paul talking to Charles Lechmere. The timing of the painful moan is set at about 3:30, which was the time the 3:07 goods train from New Cross passed. That is 23 minutes later. Now, if all of this is correct, then Lechmere can hardly have murdered Polly Nichols at 3:30 and still been hanging around on situ until 3:40 or 3:45 or whenever it was that Robert Paul saw him standing near the body. The commission of the murder would only have taken a few minutes at most. So these timings would effectively clear Lechmere, but I'll point out a few of the problems in this story. The train journey from New Cross to Whitechapel now takes 13 minutes with 6 stops. Modern underground trains don't travel that much faster than they did in 1888, and the goods train wouldn't have stopped at any of those intermediate stations, yet it supposedly took 23 minutes, 10 minutes longer. Harriet Lilley didn't specify which good train it was, and I don't know if there are other good trains at other times, at 2:07 or at 1:07 from New Cross, for example, nor do we know the timings of good trains going in the opposite direction, the other direction, back towards New Cross. So if Harriet Lilley's story is true, we don't know if she was referring to 3:07 from New Cross. The Echo seems to have guessed that it was the 3:07 to harmonise her account as much as possible with the murder. Harriet Lilley said she heard the voices under her window, which was some yards away from the crime scene, difficult to reconcile with Paul's conversation with Lechmere. It'll be noted that Harriet Lilley gave this interview to the Echo a week after the events took place, and doesn't seem to have spoken to the police about what she claimed to have heard, even though a policeman was stationed in Bucks Row after the murder, so local residents could come forward with any useful information they might have. Unlike 2 of her neighbours, Harriet Lilley didn't appear at the inquest, nor does she feature in any of the extant police reports. The late appearance of Harriet Lilley and her apparent reluctance to provide the authorities with this information brings the reliability of her statement into question. We also have it through the lens of a reporter who is not a trained criminal investigator. There are other benchmarks against which we can judge the reliability of Harriet Lilley's account. Inspector Spratling of J Division of the Metropolitan Police, in whose area the murders had taken place, wrote this in his internal report of Friday the 31st of August, on the very day the murder had taken place. I made inquiries and was informed by Mrs. Emma Green, a widow, New Cottage, adjoining, and Mr. Walter Perkist, Essex Wharf, opposite, none of whom heard any scream during the night. So on the day of the murder, Spratling interviewed various people, including 2 who lived much closer to the crime scene than Harriet Lilley, Emma Green and Walter Perkis, and they both heard nothing. Incidentally, I've taken the police reports from my well-thumbed copy of the Ultimate Jack the Ripper sourcebook. To orientate you, this is Durwood Street, used to be called Bucks Row. Over here is where the door to Brown Stable Yard used to be, where the body was found. Just over here was New Cottage, which is where Emma Green lived. And this, where this building is here, is roughly where Harriet Lilley lived, at this window more or less here. And New Cottage stuck out a little bit in front of the other houses in Bucks Row, so it's slightly set back. And over this side of the road is where we had Essex Wharf, which is where the Perkis family lived, and the only building that's still here is the school behind there, and this wall is the original wall of the railway, and that's underneath there, far below, is where the baggage train would have been going in this direction from New Cross, which is in that direction. I'm going to show you a few illustrations from Jack the Ripper CSI Whitechapel, which give a good idea of the relative positions of Harriet Lilley's window, the Green family's house, Essex Wharf, and the crime scene and the bridge wall over which the railway under which the baggage train passed. They give a good impression of what the area looked like at the time. The main inaccuracy of the pictures is the positioning of the lamps, but that isn't relevant to this discussion. Inspector Spratling appeared at the inquest into the death of Polly Nichols on Monday the 3rd of September 1888. It was in a building just over the road there. He stated, Mrs. Green, who also lived opposite the spot, had been seen, and during the night she had not heard anything, although she was up until 4:30 that morning. Mr. Purkis, who also lived close by, stated his wife had been pacing the room that morning about the time the murder must have been committed, but she had not heard anything. Like his earlier report, Spratling's testimony would have been based upon his notes from when he interviewed these people immediately after the murder took place. On the third day of the inquest, held on Monday the 17th of September 1888, the following exchange took place between Spratling and the coroner, Wynne Baxter. Spratling stated he had made inquiries in Bucks Row, but not at all the houses. The coroner replied, then that will have to be done. Spratling added that he had made inquiries at the Greens, the Wharf, Snyder's factory, and also at the Great Eastern Wharf, and no one had heard anything unusual on the morning of the murder. He had not called at any of the houses in Bucks Row, except at Mrs. Green's. The importance of the above testimony is that even after Harriet Lilley's newspaper interview given on the 6th of September, the police had clearly not bothered to interview her, or indeed most of the residents in Bucks Row, for which the coroner admonished them. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson wrote a detailed report from his desk at Scotland Yard on the 19th of October 1888, summarising the case up to that point. The inhabitants of Bucks Row were questioned, but they were unable to help the police in the slightest degree. They had not seen the woman, nor had they heard any scream or noise. Does this indicate that by the 19th of October, the police had rectified their previous omission in not interviewing all the residents in Bucks Row? To some in Ripperology, Chief Inspector, I should say, at this stage in his career, Donald Swanson's word is sacrosanct. Now let's come to the two witnesses that Spratling had referred to several times. Emma Green lived with her daughter and two sons next door to the Lilleys on one side and the crime scene on the other. She also testified at the inquest on the 17th of September.
Her daughter went to bed when she did, and they occupied the same room. It was a front room on the first floor. Witness did not remember waking up until she heard a knock on the front door about 4 o'clock in the morning. Witness heard nothing unusual during the night, and neither her sons or daughter awoke. She was a light sleeper, and had a scream been given, she would have heard it.
Here, Emma Green says she was asleep, although she was a light sleeper. Note that earlier she seems to have told Inspector Spratling that she was awake until 4:30. Nevertheless, 4 people in the house right next to the murder heard nothing. Walter Purkis lived with his wife, 3 children and a servant directly opposite the crime scene at Essex Wharf. It was mentioned by Spratling. Like Emma Green, he testified on the 17th of September. Witness and his wife slept in the front portion of the house, the room on the 2nd floor. He did not hear anything until he was called up by the police about 4 o'clock. His wife was awake the greater portion of the night. Neither of them heard a sound during the night, and it was unusually quiet. There were 6 people in Essex Wharf, and none of them heard a thing. Walter Purkis' wife was awake most of the time. The testimony of the Green and Purkis families contradicts that of Harriet Lily. Keep watching to the end, there's lots more information to come. Please subscribe and comment. There are other problems with accepting that Polly Nichols' time of death was around 3:30, the supposed time of that goods train from New Cross. Every factor with which we can gauge the time of death steers us away from 3:30 and towards about 3:40 or even after. Dr. Llewellyn, who arrived at the crime scene at about 4:10, estimated that the time of death was probably less than 30 minutes before. These estimates are just that, they're estimates. Yet it is the only one, and so the best one, and we have it from a professional medical officer. This places the time of death at being between 3:40 and 3:45. Robert Paul testified that he thought he felt a movement in the victim's breast, signifying almost certainly the last spasm of her life. Based on this testimony, in his summing up, the coroner questioned whether she was actually clinically dead at that moment. This cannot realistically have been the case if the attack had occurred at 3:30. Neither Lechmere nor Paul testified to seeing any blood, yet they saw her hands, her hat, and that her dress was up to her hips, nor did they apparently get any blood on their hands despite touching the body in multiple locations, nor did they apparently tread in any blood, even though they were very close, literally in touching distance, and despite later witnesses describing a pool of blood under Polly's neck. This suggests that the throat wound was very fresh and blood from it was flowing out slowly under gravity, the heart having stopped pumping. This is only consistent with the throat having been cut just before Paul's appearance and not 10 or so minutes before he arrived. So the totality of the medical, physical and blood evidence suggests the time of death as being around 3:40 rather than 3:30. I've covered these issues extensively in previous videos, to which I'll link in the description below. These factors, when taken together, make a time of death much before 3:40 virtually impossible. In investigative terms though, how valuable is evidence such as that supplied by Harriet Lilley? Now, there was quite an interesting talk given to the 2013 Jack the Ripper conference in London by someone called Jon Rees. I'll provide a link to his paper in the description below if you want to read it in full. And it dealt with this issue of witness testimony, not with particular regard to Harriet Lilley, but to witness accounts in general. I'll extract the following though, which have particular bearing on the Harriet Lilley case. Now, the Innocence Project estimates that around 75% of convictions where the accused was later exonerated by DNA evidence, their conviction was the result of faulty eyewitness testimony, and the American Civil Liberties Union agrees with that figure. That alone tells you that eyewitnesses are not reliable. I'll provide links to the source information from Innocence Project and the American Civil Liberties Union also below. But why are eyewitnesses unreliable? Among factors that affect the retention of memory are, for example, if there's a delay between the event and the witness recounting the event, then unsurprisingly the recollection becomes less reliable. Studies show that there's a marked reduction in memory after a week. And remember, Harriet Lilley gave her statement a week after the event. Post-event information, what you find out about the event after it's happened, drastically alters your perception and memory. Harriet Lilley had access to multiple newspaper reports and her neighbours' gossip during that week. I'll quote the next section in full because it has a bearing on how the reporter conducted his interview with Harriet Lilley. Memory is malleable, and how, when retrieving a memory, we reconstruct a series of events. Misinformation can be placed in memory due to leading or misleading or poorly worded questions, and this can later be present in subsequent recalls, indistinguishable from the actual event that occurred. Professor David Cantor, who has incidentally addressed several Jack the Ripper conferences himself, was quoted in this interesting passage, which actually related to the Lockerbie bombing. It is now well established by psychologists that when a witness genuinely claims to remember with confidence, is open to influence from various sources, that will lead to distortions in the actual memory. The processes at play in the present case are probably more powerful because of Mr. Gauchi's apparent desire to please and his recognition of the importance of his testimony. This could give rise to a phenomenon known as the reduction of cognitive dissonance, in which a person adjusts his cognitions to accord with his actions. In this case, unconsciously adjusting his confidence in his opinion to make it coherent and with his commitment to helping the police inquiry. Mr. Gauchi, as I said, was a witness in the Lockerbie case. Anyway, his desire to please, wanting to be helpful, led to distorted memory, unintentionally. The sort of evidence supplied by Harriet Lilley is known to be the most unreliable type known to criminology. This doesn't make Harriet Lilley or people like her a liar. It's almost certainly the case that with Harriet Lilley we have recreated memory. She was interviewed a week after the event took place. This was ample time for her to absorb multiple news stories in circulation and neighbourhood gossip over an event that had occurred so close to her home and which had become a massively sensationalised murder. It would have become very tempting to become involved in this. She would have had no reason to believe that there was any significance attached to whatever she might or might not have heard during that restless night when it happened, until after the event. Those moments she claims to have heard, these noises, she was in a sleep-deprived state, which would have magnified and developed any senses that she later had. Furthermore, as I've mentioned, her interviewer was not criminologically trained, and the newspaper in any case seems to have guessed which train related to her account. Harriet Lilley's account is contradicted by two witnesses who lived nearer to the crime scene and who both gave immediate statements and who were both chosen by the coroner to appear at the inquest. Harriet Lilley wasn't called to the inquest, and she wasn't mentioned in any of the weekly summary reports that were sent to Scotland Yard from the local divisions of the Metropolitan Police, nor did she make it into the lengthy summary reports by Inspector Aberline on the 19th of September or Chief Inspector Swanson on the 19th of October 1888. If you don't make it onto any of these as a witness, what does it imply? The police cannot have put the slightest weight on Harriet Lilley's account. They must have regarded it as irrelevant or quite simply false. The only account we do have is her newspaper interview with the Echo, and no other newspaper followed it up. What does that tell you? When evaluating evidence such as Harriet Lilley's newspaper interview, we have to take all evidence into consideration. Unfortunately, in the odd world of Ripperology, you find talking heads who seize upon one item, such as Harriet Lilley's interview, and run with it as some sort of eureka moment, often as a futile attempt to negate the Lechmere theory. We are left with the overwhelming certainty that the Harriet Lilley story is totally worthless as evidence as to Polly's likely time of death. And in the Jack the Ripper case, there are a lot of other witnesses of similar worth. In one respect, Harriet Lilley's interview is of some significance. It shows that up to the 6th of September, the police had failed to interview all but a handful of people in Bucks Row and had in fact been negligent in the pursuit of their investigation. For this, they were admonished by the coroner as late as the 17th of September, by which time the police had another murder to investigate, that of Annie Chapman, and within 2 weeks they had 2 more to investigate, those of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. This illustrates perfectly how essential issues can, and still do, frequently get missed in serial killing investigations. With one case after another, the police suffer from information overload. It's also an interesting story to illustrate the way in which some locals wish to become over helpful in the case, and it is furthermore illustrative of how the press attempted to run parallel investigations and second-guess the police investigation by following up and finding their own witnesses. In contrast, the press collectively made no attempt to follow up with Lechmere, and seemingly found him spectacularly uninteresting, which will of course have been his intention, so he could slip back into anonymity after his forced appearance at the inquest. The Harriet Lily case illustrates the police failure to interview all but a handful of residents in Bucks Road. Their investigation was not very thorough, probably caused by information overload, as I said. It's clear that the police, like the press, also failed to follow up with Lechmere, to the extent that they never so much as discovered that his true name was Lechmere and not Cross. This shoddy police work allowed Lechmere to escape justice, and the Harriet Lily interview illuminates how that happened. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, share and like, comment below, and look out for our next video. Goodbye.